the Perceptual and Cognitive Science Forum. So this is an annual event that originally was part of the Perceptual Science program. It was an event where everybody gets to present in their community gets to present their work to each other, and it's something we look forward to every year. And in the last few years, we've expanded it to include the entire cognitive science community, and it's a terrific event that we all look forward to. I should mention Tom Griffiths, our speaker today, was supposed to be the keynote last year. Unfortunately, we had to scuttle the entire event due to the pandemic. So we're very grateful for Tom coming back today and rescheduling, although in a somewhat different manner than we had originally anticipated. So let me tell everybody about Tom. So I first met Tom when he was a graduate student working with Josh Tenenbaum. He was actually a Stanford graduate student working at MIT with Josh. And since then, as many of you know, and probably everybody listening to me knows, the two of them, Tom, sometimes with Josh and later with many other students and collaborators, have become the epicenter of the Bayesian movement in cognitive science. They've worked out how probabilistic theory applies to mental function in just a dizzying array of areas of cognition, and have published a huge number of incredibly influential papers, essentially creating the field of Bayesian cognitive science. These papers have made profound contributions to a number of fields: cognitive science, psychology, but also computer science, biology, and neuroscience. And they're particularly admirable because they touch on big abstract issues about the nature of the mind, as well as sometimes very nitty-gritty issues about algorithmic complexity and tractability, some of which I think that Tom's going to talk about today. After graduate school, when I first met Tom, he moved he was a professor at Brown and then at Berkeley, and finally hopefully to Princeton, where he is now the Henry Luce Professor of Information Technology, Consciousness, and Culture at the Departments of Psychology and Computer Science. Along the way, he's won numerous awards and honors, including various early career impact awards, one from the Cognitive Science Society, an Outstanding Young Investigator Award from the Psychonomic Society, and most recently the Troland Award from the National Academy of Science. Let me just summarize my own sense of Tom's reputation with a slightly profane anecdote that I can only paraphrase. I happened to be chatting with one of Tom's senior colleagues when he was still at Berkeley. But at the time, he was contemplating whether or not to leave to come to Princeton. I believe that was the timing. And this senior faculty member just sort of looked wistful. This was back in the days when I was actually sitting in the room with him. He looked wistful and just muttered, "That guy is just so effing smart." That's not exactly how he said it, but I thought it was very effectively put. So it's a tremendous pleasure to welcome Tom here today, and I hope everybody will enjoy his talk. So let me just say, I think if people have questions for Tom as he goes, please say so in the chat, and we'll develop a little bit of queue. If you have a clarification question, something that would be better answered immediately, please maybe go ahead and unmute yourself and just ask it. But otherwise, maybe hold questions for the Q&A, which we should have plenty of time for. Okay, Tom, thank you very much. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, Jacob. Thanks for that very kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure to have the chance to interact with you all. Although obviously, I'm sad that we're not able to do it in person. So the work I'm going to talk about today, I should say, is joint work with some of my students and former students, Falk Leader, Fred Calloway, and Michael Chang, who are now distributed across a few different institutions. And it actually engages with some questions that come up, partly as a consequence, as Jacob was saying, of being affiliated with these two departments, psychology and computer science, because they're two departments that give me really a different kind of perspective on how human minds work and what human minds do. So, if I am hanging out in the psychology department, the kind of picture that I get of the human mind is one where humans are perhaps somewhat embarrassing, right? If you read the kind of popular literature from psychology on how human minds work, you discover that we're predictably irrational, we're subject to inevitable illusions, we seem to know things that aren't so, and our minds are some kind of kludge that is sort of patched together to do a okay job of trying to solve the challenging problems that we face. Whereas if I talk to my colleagues in the computer science department, there's a different perspective on human minds where, in many ways, human minds are inspiring. They're the things that motivate us to build artificial intelligence systems or machine learning systems to try and capture the kinds of capacities that human beings have, they're the best examples that we have of systems that are able to solve the kinds of problems that we associate with intelligence. And if you're not sort of sufficiently inspired by that, if you sort of look at these cases where we have like AI systems starting to beat humans, this is a classic example. This is the game between Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov, and something that ended up being a major victory for artificial intelligence. It's also worth remembering that in some ways, these games are not played on an even playing field. So for example, in this situation, we had on the one hand, the human here is sort of able to consider roughly on the order of 1 chess position per second, whereas the computer is able to search over 100,000 positions per second. And the human is working off maybe some black coffee and a piece of toast, whereas the computer is working off a large industrial power plant. And so, what humans are really good at is not just being smart, but being smart in a way which is using our cognitive resources in a way that's very efficient. And again, if you're not impressed enough by that, it's worth pointing out that the same human that's able to play a game of chess is able to prove theorems, put a diaper on a baby, compose songs, and do all sorts of other kinds of things that aren't just playing chess. Whereas many of the systems that we build at the moment that are AI systems are things that are dedicated to a single kind of task. So, when we look at human minds from this computer science perspective, we see systems that are inspiring along these various dimensions, but in particular, inspiring in the way that they're able to make efficient use of these resources to do many different kinds of things. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to try and resolve this paradox a little bit, where we have this two views of human minds. On the one hand, sort of very error prone. On the other hand, inspiring in these various ways. And I think that we can do that by asserting sort of two premises that I think on the surface are not things that are necessarily controversial. So the first of these premises is the idea that humans have limited cognitive resources. And that's something which leads us to make errors when we're doing things like decision making. But the second is that we do quite a good job of using those resources. And it's this capacity for using our resources effectively that makes it possible for us to solve many of these different problems that we face in a way that's efficient. And so the first of these ideas is not something that's particularly novel. It's something that sort of goes all the way back to people like Herb Simon in the middle of the 20th century, this sort of proposal of bounded rationality, that maybe we can make more sense of human behavior by thinking about the constraints on rational action that we're able to take. And the second of these ideas, perhaps, is something that we've only formally begun to explore more recently. And I'm going to focus on an approach to characterizing this that I've developed together with some of my collaborators, something that we call resource rational analysis. And so the first step in this process is really to change the way that we think about what rationality is. So if we go back and we look at our kind of standard definition of rational decision making, the way that I think we conventionally think about what rationality is in terms of something like expected utility theory, right? So expected utility theory says, when faced with a set of actions that we could take, we're going to take the action that has highest expected utility. If we write this out in an equation, the equation looks something like this, right? We're going to take the maximum over the set of actions that we can take of the expected utility of the associated action. And if you kind of reduce this down to a slogan or a bumper sticker, right? That slogan is do the right thing, right? The emphasis is on choosing the action that gives you the greatest reward. Interestingly, that's not the only definition of rationality that's out there. So one of the problems with this way of defining rational action is that it doesn't say anything about the amount of computation you're going to have to do, the amount of cognitive effort you're going to have to expend in this process of choosing this appropriate action. So one of the problems with this way of thinking about rationality is that it's not a standard that any realistic system could hope to attain. It's not something that a human can attain. It's not something a computer can attain. Any system which has finite computational resources is not going to be able to succeed by this metric of always choosing the action that has highest expected utility. And so if we go to the artificial intelligence literature and we look at the sort of alternative conceptions of rationality that are being proposed there, things that give us a criterion that's actually achievable by some kind of finite system. One of these criteria is something that's called meta-level rationality. There's a closely related notion of bounded optimality. that was developed by Stuart Russell and colleagues and Eric Horvitz in the 1980s. And what they were trying to do was really say, okay, if we're building AI systems, what should be the goal of those systems? What's the best that we can hope to do? And it looks a little more like this. So meta-level rational agents are going to be agents that use the strategy that best trades off utility and computational cost. So here what we've done is move the emphasis from taking the best action to put the emphasis on finding the best strategy, finding the best policy or the best algorithm, where we can define a criterion for what makes an algorithm, policy, or strategy good, which is that if you follow that strategy, then you do well on this metric of the sum of the expected utility that arises from following the algorithm minus the computational cost that's involved. And the way that this is characterized is, in fact, in terms of, the sort of, you can think about a strategy or an algorithm or a policy here as specifying a sequence of computations that you engage in. Those computations result in a set of beliefs about the world. And then you're going to end up taking the best action that you can based on the beliefs that you have. And so under this criterion of meta-level rationality, you're doing well as a rational agent if you're engaging in the right computations such that you end up with a set of beliefs that allow you to take an action that at the end of the day is a reasonable action to take. And so if we try and express this as a sort of slogan or a bumper sticker, it says, do the right thinking, right? The emphasis here has been moved off the action that we take in the external world and onto the internal computations that we perform to allow us to get to the point where we're informed enough to be able to take that action in the world. And so in our work, we often refer to this kind of criterion and closely related ones as the idea of resource rationality, because what it's doing is it's really putting the emphasis on making rational use of the cognitive resources that are available to you. So another way of thinking about this is that we've made a shift from thinking about rationality in terms of the external actions that we take to thinking about rationality in terms of the internal actions that we take, in terms of how we deploy the cognitive resources that we have. And so, to further try and reduce this to something that's a kind of cartoon, right? Here's the sort of picture you could have in your head, which is that expected utility theory is fundamentally a kind of behaviorist theory of rational action. It's one that just focuses on the external actions you take in the world and says nothing about what should be going on inside your head. Whereas this kind of criterion of resource rationality is actually the sort of criterion that we might want as cognitive psychologists or as people who are interested in understanding human cognitive states for thinking about how it is that we make machines that emulate them. Because what it does is it puts the emphasis on the internal computations that you should be engaging in order to inform the external actions that you end up taking. And so what I'm going to argue in the rest of this talk is really that this kind of criterion is one that equips us far better for answering the kinds of questions that we're interested in as cognitive scientists, and gives us new tools for making sense of human minds and also for thinking about how to build machine systems that capture some of those human capacities. So the basic structure of the rest of the talk is two parts. In the first part, what I'm going to do is kind of engage with the psychological literature that's led to that kind of picture of human minds as irrational and kludgy and so on, which is the literature on heuristics and biases. And I'm going to show you how using this perspective, we can actually understand some of the classic kinds of deviations from rationality that we see in human behavior. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to engage with a sort of more generative question, which is, can we, using this kind of framework, then make predictions about the kinds of cognitive processes that we expect people to engage in, just as a consequence of describing the sorts of computational problems that we need to solve in a way that then allows us to generalize that to other kinds of systems as well. And so here in this first part, really the focus is on trying to build a link between this idea of rationality on the one hand and this kind of framework of heuristics and biases that's classically been sort of held up as a contrast to rational accounts of behavior. And through the work that we've done in this area, I think we've managed to show that some of these classic heuristics are actually things that we can characterize in this kind of framework of resource rationality. That when we start to think about the cost of computation and the kinds of cognitive resources that we might expect people to have, the sorts of heuristic strategies that they engage in are actually things that make a lot of sense. And one way that you can think about this is that, in fact, this criterion of resource rationality just gives us a way of defining what makes something a good heuristic. If you think about the way that heuristics are standardly defined in psychology, they're typically defined somewhat heuristically. right? They're sort of things that you can do that are relatively simple and produce relatively good outcomes. But that kind of trade-off, right, between simplicity and the quality of the outcome is exactly what's formalized in resource rationality. And so I'm going to just sort of quickly give you two examples of classic heuristics where this kind of analysis can give us some insight. And then that'll set us up for the rest of the talk where we talk about, actually sort of deriving these things from scratch. And so the first of these examples is the heuristic of anchoring and adjustment. And this is a classic heuristic that goes all the way back to the work of Kahneman and Tversky. And it's a heuristic that applies in the context of trying to estimate a quantity. So I'm somewhat ambitiously going to try and make this an interactive component of this talk. So I'm going to ask you some questions. When I ask you those questions, they're going to be questions where I'm asking you to estimate a quantity. What I would like you to do is type into the chat your estimate. And then we will actually collect some data and we can see how you do. So here's the first question. What is the freezing point of vodka? So just to sort of think about it, estimate it yourself, and then type it into the chat. And this is in degrees Fahrenheit. Great. Okay. Second question. How long is Mars's orbit around the sun expressed in Earth days? Okay, I think we're getting close. All right, interesting. Okay, all right, so I'll give you some answers now. Okay, so the freezing point of vodka is minus 17 degrees Fahrenheit. And the length of Mars's orbit around the sun is 687 days. And I think the phenomenon that we see, if you go back and look through the chat here, is that in both cases, what's happened is, so we've overestimated the freezing point of vodka and underestimated the duration of Mars's orbit. And that's consistent with this anchoring and adjustment phenomenon. So the idea is that when you're posed with questions like this, the way that you answer them is start with some familiar quantity, like say the freezing point of water or the duration of Earth's orbit, and then adjust away from it. And then you do so inadequately and you end up as a consequence having a bias, right? And that's consistent with the data that we generated here. So what the kind of resource rational approach to explaining this would be is to say, well, let's think first of all about the computational problem we're trying to solve, and then think about what reasonable algorithms might be for solving that, and then we can analyze what the optimal strategies look like. And so the way I'm going to do this is to sort of break this down into a task, which is to try and estimate this quantity based on whatever information we have bouncing around in our head. I'm going to assume that the computational architecture is something it's called a Markup chain Monte Carlo algorithm that's called the Metropolis Hastings algorithm. That'll be familiar to a bunch of the computer sciencey people in the room, and I'll explain it in a moment. But in fact, the choice that we make here isn't particularly important, and I'll explain why in a moment. And then we'll just make the assumption that cost is something that increases linearly in the number of samples. So this is just sort of like an opportunity cost kind of assumption that the more time you spend on this, the less reward you're gaining from other kinds of opportunities you could be pursuing. And so this Metropolis Hastings algorithm is basically just an iterative updating algorithm for estimating a quantity. The way that it works is what we want to do is we've got some probability distribution that we want to generate samples from. That's this probability distribution up here, P. The way we're going to do that is we're going to start out with some initial value, and then we're going to just propose a variation on that initial value. And then we make a decision about whether to accept that proposal, where we're sort of slightly more likely to, we're more likely to accept things that go in the direction of increasing probability and less likely to accept them as we go in the direction of decreasing probability. And then the sort of magic of this algorithm is it doesn't matter where you start out. Over time, as you do this, it sort of converges to similar values, and then you can actually show that what it converges to is this distribution that we're trying to sample from. So here I've started out 3 chains at different points. After some time, they come together, and the distribution that they've converged to is the one that's shown here. So if I take just the last half of all of these chains and aggregate it, that's what gives us the gray histogram here. Okay, so this is going to be our sort of assumption about the cognitive mechanism that you might engage in. It's one where you're sort of iteratively updating your estimate. Your anchor is the starting point. And so the natural question we can ask is kind of like, how long is it going to take you to converge? And then how much thinking should you do? Like, what's the point at which you should stop this iterative updating process? And what you can show is that for this algorithm, it has a nice property, which is that it essentially converges geometrically, or sort of the amount of bias is decaying here sort of exponentially in the amount of computation that you're doing. And so, if you start sort of further out, then you're going to have more bias to begin with. And so it takes longer for that to go away. But you see this kind of pattern of geometric or exponential convergence here. And then if you think about this, what that means is that each iteration that you're doing has diminishing benefit in reducing your bias and reducing how different you are from the quantity that you're trying to estimate. And so because you have that decreasing benefit for increasing computation, and you have a linearly increasing cost for engaging in additional computation, there's going to be a point where you should stop computing and you should accept being biased. So there's a rational amount of bias that's a consequence of the way in which this algorithm converges. And so we can actually plot out, well, what's the rational amount of bias as a function of the cost, the ratio of the cost per iteration of the algorithm to the cost of making an error. And so, as the cost of iterations increases, the rational amount of bias increases, although the exact amount of bias that you end up with is going to depend on sort of how far away your anchor was from that initial point. And so, and here this distance is being expressed in standard deviations of that distribution we're trying to converge to. And so the key result here is that if you are following an algorithm like this one, where you have diminishing returns from additional computation, and that's not just true of this algorithm, it's also true of things like gradient descent and a broad class of iterative algorithms, then there's going to be a rational point at which you should stop such that you end up with a bias. And even more than that, we can actually predict the amount of bias that you should have. So this is taking data from Epley and Gilovich that my little demo earlier on was based on, right? This is sort of showing how much people manage to sort of accurately adjust away from the anchor that they started out with. And we can predict the amount that they will end up sort of effectively adjusting based on estimates of the sort of variance of that distribution, like sort of how certain you are about the original quantity, how far away your original anchor is. And we can sort of plug those things into that model and spit out predictions about exactly how wrong people are going to be in estimating these quantities. And this very simple model also explains a bunch of other phenomena that have shown up in the literature. So for example, being under greater cognitive load, time pressure, or drinking alcohol, they're all things that reduce the amount of adjustment because they basically increase the computational cost for engaging in further iterations, whereas incentives are things that can increase it because they're increasing the cost of making errors. That the amount of bias increases with anchor extremity, that uncertainty increases anchoring because they're about these sort of relationships between the variability of that distribution and where you start out. And that knowledge can abolish the anchoring bias for exactly the opposite reason. It sort of means that an original distribution is much tighter and you converge to it more quickly. So this sort of very simple model is enough that it gives us a sort of handle on some of these kind of classic phenomena that are associated with this heuristic. The second heuristic I'm going to talk about is the availability of extreme events. So this kind of availability heuristic, again, is something that goes all the way back to the work of Kahneman and Tversky, the idea that people overestimate the probability of events that come to mind easily. And one kind of events that comes to mind easily is sort of something that's an extreme event. So for example, if you're making a decision about whether you should go snorkeling, you should be thinking about this, but you might be thinking about this, right? And you probably found yourself engaging in similar kind of extreme event driven reasoning over the last year or so as you've been thinking about the kinds of risks that we face in our everyday lives. And so what we like to do is to sort of try and understand what the origins of this phenomenon are. Again, it's something which has been held up as a kind of irrational bias that we have to think about these events. what I'm going to show you is that actually this is a very sensible kind of thing to do if you're trying to make a decision with limited cognitive resources. So here, the task that we're trying to engage in is one of, say, estimating the expected utility of an action. You're going to try to decide if you should do something or not. You want to know whether that's a reasonable thing to do. The problem is that this is costly, right? So to evaluate this expected utility, you need to integrate across all of the possible things that could happen, the utility associated with that times the probability of it happening. And then we're going to assume that the way that you're doing this, because this is costly, is rather than considering all of those outcomes, you're going to consider a sample of the outcomes, just drawn from some probability distribution. And you're actually going to have a choice about the distribution that you draw these from. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And then again, we'll assume that cost increases linear in the number of samples. So the idea is really what you want to do is get a good estimate of expected utility while keeping the number of samples you draw as small as possible. Okay. So the question that we want to answer is, in this regime of small numbers of samples, what choice should you make for the probability distribution you're going to generate your samples from in order to evaluate this expected utility? And the simplest response that you might have is, well, how about we just generate them from this probability distribution P, right? A very simple kind of strategy you can follow is to say, to evaluate the expected utility, I'm just going to consider events with exactly the probability that they might happen, just sort of generate samples in my head with the probability that they might happen in the world. I'll add up the utilities associated with those, and that'll give me an estimate of my expected utility. So this procedure, we could call it unbiased sampling, because what it does is it guarantees that the estimate that you get is an unbiased estimate of the expected utility. Is something that might make sense in some circumstances, but in this small sample regime, it's something which can be problematic, particularly in cases where there's a low probability extreme outcome. So for example, if you were trying to make a decision about whether you should play a game of Russian roulette, you would have to generate 51 samples from this distribution where there's 5 okay things and 1 terrible thing in order to have a 99.99% chance of discovering that this was a bad thing to do, right? And so when you've got a single rare outcome that is very, very bad, having an unbiased sample might be less important than having a sample which might, allow you to capture those rare events, but in a way that ends up inducing some bias. So another way of putting this is that really what you care about in this situation is not just the bias, it's the variance of the estimate that you're getting. And so in this situation, literally the variance could be the thing that kills you. So when a statistician is faced with this kind of problem, where you've got a low probability extreme event, the way that they solve it is using a different kind of sampling procedure, something that's called importance sampling. So here's a kind of sort of cartoon version of how importance sampling works. We have some probability distribution that we want to generate samples from. That's our distribution P. We're going to do that by generating samples from another distribution, Q. And we're going to take the samples we generate from Q and then correct them for the fact that they came from the wrong distribution. So in fact, what we're going to do is say, well, this sample was in a region where P is greater than Q, so we'll upweight this one. This sample was from a region where Q is greater than P, so we'll downweight this one. And so you kind of correct for the fact that you're going to oversample in this region and undersample, here and here and here by, when you've generated these samples, assigning weights that sort of correct for that. And it turns out the right way to do that is you just set the weight that's associated with each sample to the ratio of its probability under P to its probability under Q. And then you can get an estimate of the quantity that you're interested in just by taking those weights and then normalizing them, and then taking an average with respect to those weighted samples that you generated. So we can now ask, what's the right way to do this? What's the distribution that we should be generating from? What's the choice of Q that makes the most sense? And what you can show is that the variance minimizing distribution is this one, where you should sample from a distribution which is proportional to the probability of an event occurring times a term which is basically capturing its extremity. So this is the utility minus the expected utility. So this is kind of like the absolute value of the deviation from expected utility. And this is a little bit of a funny distribution to define because it assumes that we already know the quantity that we're interested in. But what it does is that it tells us that, if we want to estimate our expected utilities effectively, we want to do so by generating from a distribution that takes into account both the probability of an event and the utility that's associated with it. And so this says exactly the phenomenon that we see with people, which is that we're going to expect to oversample those events that have, extreme utilities associated with them. And the bias that's associated with this particular distribution is one that will lead us to overrepresent extreme events. So if you think about that importance sampling procedure, we sort of sample things and then we reweight them. But if you don't sort of generate enough things in the right places, then reweighting doesn't sort of fix that. So the bias of an importance sampling procedure is always in favor of the distribution which you generate from. So if you generate from a distribution which favors extreme events, then you're going to overrepresent those extreme events in the way that you end up making decisions. And so we can use this very simple model to make predictions about things like, how people overestimate the probability of all kinds of, sources of mortality or stressful events. But it also gives us a kind of cool heuristic that we can use to explain other aspects of people's decision making. So out of this importance sampling framework, we actually get a nice simple heuristic for how you can make a decision, which is you generate from this utility weighted distribution, and then you just tally the number of pros and cons. So if you work through that whole importance sampling procedure and work out the weights and so on, things cancel out. And so you should just care about what are the positives and what are the negatives when you're trying to make a decision. Those are the things that matter for deciding whether something is a good thing to do or not. And this very simple heuristic actually reproduces a bunch of classic phenomena in the decision-making literature. Okay, so again, the point of this first part of the talk was just to say, some of the things that you might have thought were good illustrations of ways in which people are irrational, I would actually take as good illustrations of ways in which people intelligently use their limited cognitive resources to allow them to solve problems that they face in the world. What I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is take that kind of framework and go one step further and say, well, now that we have this way of thinking about what cognitive processes we should be engaged in, can we figure out what the specific cognitive processes are that might correspond to a particular problem that we're trying to solve? And the reason why this is possible is that, in fact, this way of thinking about things allows us to reduce the problem of deriving optimal strategies to a problem that's a much more familiar thing that we're actually used to solving already. And the reason for this is because of what I was talking about at the very start, that we've kind of made this move where we've gone from a model of decision-making that's focused on the external world, the external actions that we take, to a model of decision-making that's focused on the internal cognitive computational actions that we engage in order to get us to the point where we can take those external actions. And so the key observation here is that the problem of choosing a cognitive strategy to follow, we can now describe as a sequential decision problem with computations as actions. And by that, what I mean is we can think about this now as the way we're going to choose what to do is by sort of saying, well, what's the first computation I should perform? Based on the results of that, what's the next one I should perform? Based on the results of that, what's the next one I should perform? And we can reduce this complicated problem of figuring out what strategy to follow to a familiar problem of making a sequence of decisions about actions to take in a particular environment. And so you can show that this can be formulated as a kind of Markup decision process, what's called a meta-level Markup decision process, that can be solved using methods from reinforcement learning. And this little asterisk here is a reminder that while this is technically true in practice, you actually have to develop all sorts of clever tricks in order to make this work, which I'm happy to talk about if people want to hear more about the details. But the key idea here is that we can take a kind of technology that we're very used to using, both in computer science and cognitive science, for thinking about the actions that agents should take in an external environment and turn it into something we can use for saying how we should navigate our internal cognitive environment. And so this technology is the Markup decision process. It's a description of, sort of the standard version of it is you imagine an agent that's in a world where we can describe the state of the world. That agent takes actions in that world. Those actions influence how the state of the world changes, but also determine the rewards that the agent receives. And then, what's going to happen is that agent is going to take a sequence of these actions in sort of trying to maximize the reward that it receives over time. So this is a model that's commonly used in reinforcement learning. It's been sort of pretty widely studied in the psychology and neuroscience of reinforcement learning, as well as in computer science. The way we turn it into something that allows us to make predictions about cognitive states is by making this move to a meta-level Markup decision process. And in this meta-level Markup decision process, now our states are beliefs, our actions are computations. Those computations change our beliefs. They're also associated with computational costs. And then after a certain point, we can take a special action and say, I'm done thinking, I've accumulated enough beliefs, I'm ready to act in the world. And then we receive a reward from the world based on choosing the action, which is the optimal action based on the current state of our beliefs. And so this formalism actually then allows us to derive, well, what are the sort of computational actions that humans should engage in when they're trying to solve the problems that they're faced with? And so as a first pass trying to understand this, we looked at a classic problem that psychologists have studied for understanding strategies that people engage in, which is called a multi-alternative risky choice task. And so this has been studied using a paradigm that's called the mouse lab paradigm, where you give people basically a choice between different gambles. For those different gambles, there's probabilities that are associated with different outcomes. And the thing that you don't know, though, is what the payoff is that's associated with a particular outcome. And the way that you reveal that information is you have to mouse over or click on one of these squares, and then that reveals the payoff information. And so this paradigm was introduced as a way of studying the kinds of strategies that people engage in decision-making. What information do they look for in order to make a decision? And so they discovered classic strategies like take the best strategy, where you focus on the outcome that has the highest probability. You sort of click across, and then you choose the gamble that has the highest payoff on that outcome. But really, the sort of space of strategies that they're able to look for here was limited by the imagination of the psychologists who were sort of studying this problem. And we can now, using this framework, actually derive, both strategies that psychologists might not have thought of, but also the optimal strategies in different situations. And so the way that we formulate this, here's our meta-level Markup decision process. To make this more concrete, the belief states here are about what the entries in those gray boxes are. The actions that we can take are sort of gathering information about the content of those boxes. And then there's some cost, either sort of implicit or explicit, that's associated with those exploratory actions. And then at the end of the day, we're going to sort of choose what gamble we want to take, and then we get a payoff that's based on that gamble. So when we solve this meta-level Markup decision process, we discover what the optimal strategies look like. And we discover that in some cases, these actually correspond exactly to the kinds of things that psychologists have found. So this take the best strategy is the optimal solution for what are called non-compensatory low stakes problems. So if you have a situation where there's one outcome that has a much higher probability than others, and the payoffs are small, then it's not worth investing a huge amount of effort because the payoffs are small, and the place where you should focus that effort is on this highest probability outcome. And so the take the best strategy works well here. But we can also discover that there are other kinds of strategies that psychologists hadn't previously found that are optimal in some circumstances, and that people actually follow those strategies in exactly those circumstances. So one of these is a strategy that we identified that combines take the best with satisficing. So what it does is, if you're in a situation where now it's the same sort of low stakes situation, so you don't want to look at everything, but now you no longer have sort of clear dominance of one of these outcomes in probability, then what you should do is kind of still focus on this highest probability outcome, but it's not really worth exploring all of the things that you could be looking at. So as soon as you see one which is above some threshold, then you should be ready to take that gamble. And so using this kind of framework, we can actually analyze what the optimal strategies look like for these sorts of decision problems. But what's cool about this is that exactly the same math applies not just to this kind of circumstance, which is a kind of somewhat artificial decision problem, but to other kinds of choices that we make as well. So here's another classic sort of choice paradigm. This is called simple choice, where you just give people things that they could have, and you say, which one of these do you want? In this case, you have a choice between different kinds of snacks. And then the thing that people are interested in is, well, what do people look at when they're making these decisions, right? What's the information that they're gathering in order to inform the decision that they make? And a classic phenomenon here is that people say they tend to choose things that they spend more time looking at. And in particular, the amount of time that you spend looking at the thing you end up choosing increases as a function of the duration of the experiment. So you sort of become more focused on the thing that you're actually going to choose. So the way that these phenomena have been explained in the psychological literature is using models like the attentional drift diffusion model, which assumes that what you're doing is basically accumulating evidence towards some threshold, and the rate at which you accumulate that evidence is affected by what you're looking at. Right? It's a very sort of mechanistic model. But we can show that we can explain exactly the same phenomena just using this kind of meta-level markup decision process model, assuming that basically what you're doing in this task is having a representation of the utility that you associate with each of these objects, having some kind of prior distribution over what those utilities are. And then when you think about something or you look at it, you're gathering a sample from the true distribution of utilities that's associated with that. And then that sample allows you to update your beliefs in a way that gets you towards more accurate beliefs about the utility that you associate with that item. And again, you can cast this in this meta-level markup decision process framework, right, where the belief states now are these utilities. The actions that you can take are your eye movements. There's costs associated with those. In this particular model, we also assume that those costs are lower for staying on the same item than they are for moving to another item. And then eventually you'll get to a point where your beliefs sort of allow you to make a decision about the thing that you actually want. And so we evaluated this model on a data set where people were basically making choices between 3 items, as I said. And we can actually show that in this case, it does a really good job of characterizing these sorts of phenomena that relate fixation, time, and choice. So we can show that, just like in the human data, the probability of making a choice increases as a function of the amount of time you've spent looking at an item. And intuitively, the reason why this happens is that if you've got 3 things in front of you, you can sort of quickly look at all of them. If you get a piece of evidence from that that tells you that one of them is less good than the others, then you're going to spend more time looking at those other 2, right? And so it sort of makes this prediction that the amount of time that you should spend looking at something will increase for things that are good things, because they're the ones that you actually have to work harder on in terms of discriminating. And so it also, as a consequence, produces these other phenomena. For example, high value items are things that are fixated more. So you spend more time looking at things that are value, and that this increases as a function of time, right? So the longer time goes, you're going to be on those higher value items. And then this produces this phenomenon where you're sort of most likely to choose the thing that you looked at last as a consequence of the fact that you're focusing your sampling on these higher quality things. So these problems that I've talked about have been mostly sort of focused on kind of relatively simple sorts of decision-making situations. And my motivating example here was something far more complicated, a kind of complex sort of planning. But we can use the same kind of framework to think about what we do in these more complex planning situations too. We haven't done anything as complicated as chess. This is what our planning problem looks like. You basically have to help this spider to find its way through this graph and sort of identify the path where the sum of the rewards that you receive along that path is greatest. So you don't have to be Gary Kasparov to solve this problem. The thing that makes it a little more complicated is that we use the same trick as in the mouse lab experiments, where you don't actually know what the value of each of these rewards looks like. And so what we're interested in is where people choose to click to reveal the associated rewards as they're engaging in solving this planning problem. And again, this is something we can express as a meta-level markup decision process, right? So here the space is the values of those rewards that you take are clicking on things. There's a cost associated with that. And then you get a payoff at the end based on the path that you choose. And what we can show is that in this situation, the solution to that meta-level markup decision process does a better job of characterizing human behavior than a lot of the kinds of planning and search algorithms that we're used to using in science. Things like best first search, breadth first search, depth first search, progressive deepening, and so on, are all things that do a less good job of characterizing people's behavior. And part of this is that people show a kind of adaptiveness in their search behavior that's not standardly captured in these kinds of algorithms. And so this is illustrated here. So what this is plotting is, this is the best expected value of the expected value of the best path that you've discovered so far. And then this is the number of clicks that you've made so far. And then what these squares correspond to is the color shows how likely it is that you'll stop your search as a function of these 2 variables. And so what you should be able to see is that as you go from the bottom left here, so you've not found anything good, you haven't made many clicks, to the top right, you found something good, you've made a lot of clicks, you can see that this sort of changes from dark blue to yellow. And it does so in a way where you can sort of see it does it along this diagonal. And what this tells you is that what people are doing is there's sort of a frontier here of how they're trading off the best path that they've found so far with the number of clicks that they've made. So they've kind of like got this same kind of trade-off that I showed you earlier in the context of that anchoring and adjustment problem, right? Where they're taking into account, well, what are the diminishing returns that are associated with, clicking more, gathering more information as a function of the quality of what they've discovered so far. And so this kind of adaptive behavior is exactly the thing that our optimal solution that we derive using that meta-level Markov decision process captures. But it's not something which is a sort of standard part of these kinds of planning or search algorithms that we use for comparing against human behavior. More generally, I think this kind of approach of thinking about the rational use of cognitive resources is something that has a lot to contribute to AI and machine learning. So one of the important aspects of this is that I think it gives us a way of understanding some of the sort of generality and flexibility of human cognition. So kind of there's a ironic lesson here, right? So the fact that humans have limited cognitive resources means that we have to be experts at figuring out how to reuse those resources to allow us to solve a very wide range of problems. And so if you want to make learners that are able to perform heterogeneous kinds of tasks, having that constraint where you have limited resources that you can use to solve those tasks is actually something which is beneficial in the sense that it means that you have to develop this same kind of capacity for making efficient use of those resources. And so there are a bunch of problems that show up in AI that on the surface don't look like meta reasoning, right? Meta reasoning is something that has its origins in this AI literature. But when you have this lens and you look at the kind of problems that come up in contemporary machine learning, you can also see this sort of structure that's characteristic of these meta-level Markov decision processes. So I'm just going to give you one example of this, which is an example of learning the structure of a deep neural network, right? Something where you can do all sorts of things. You can search, you can use genetic algorithms. People have done all sorts of things in this space. But you can also just formulate this problem as a problem of solving a meta-level Markov decision process. And the way that this works, we kind of think about the problem as an iteration between two processes. One which takes an input and then chooses a function to apply to that input. And then another that takes that function, applies it, and then produces an output. And then the output feeds back into this process. And so you can sort of think about this schematically as what you're doing when you're applying a neural network, right? So you get some input to your neural network. Each layer of that neural network applies some function to that input. The output, right, becomes the input to the next layer. And the output of that becomes the input to the next layer, and so on. And so this controller here, you could think about is actually making a choice about what layer of the neural network to apply next from a set of sort of pre-trained modular layers that it could be applying. And in the most general case, you can be learning what these functions are at the same time as you're learning this controller. And so the way that this works, the input comes in, controller makes a choice of the function to apply. That function is then applied to the data, and then that produces an output, right? You make a choice about what function to apply, and so on. And so if these functions correspond to different sort of neural network layers you could apply, the path through this set of layers is going to correspond to a neural network that you've constructed to solve the problem. And then at some endpoint, the controller can say, okay, that's it, we're done. And then you output the output that comes out of that layer of the neural network. And so this is exactly a meta-level Markov decision process, where the actions that meta-level Markov decision process is taking correspond to the functions that are being applied. And the state space corresponds to these sort of inputs or intermediate computations. And what's cool about this is that this idea that you can be selecting what computations you want to perform in sequence gives you the capacity to engage in a kind of compositional generalization, where now you can solve a wide range of problems as a consequence of sort of piecing together different subproblems that correspond to the layers of these networks. So rather than having to train a separate network for every problem or one monolithic network that solves all of those problems, it looks sort of something more like this, where you've got all of these pieces that you put together in various ways to allow you to solve this range of problems. And so, a simple example of this might be something like multilingual translation, right? Where if you know sort of how to translate from English to French and how to translate from French to Spanish, then that means that you can translate from English to Spanish by putting together those computations. And we actually sort of simulated this kind of process where we had a system that was trained on translating different pairs of languages, and then it could automatically construct the meta-level MDP for translating between novel pairs of languages. But the same kind of structure shows up in the context of things like trying to transform an image in order to get it into a canonical form. The way we set up this problem, you're sort of learning what sequence of transformations to apply in order to take a distorted image and then put it through a standardized classifier. And this system is able to learn appropriate transformations and the sequence in which to apply them in order to solve this problem in a way that allows it to then generalize better than a system that was trained without this capacity to produce these sorts of generalizations. So I think the sort of high level conclusions here are, first of all, this kind of notion of resource rational analysis gives us a more realistic set of expectations about rationality, right? You can go easier on yourself for deviations from expected utility, because those deviations are exactly what we expect from any finite system that has limits on the amount of cognitive resources that it has for solving different kinds of problems. And I think this really gives us a tool for revisiting some of the classic questions that we're interested in cognitive psychology. There's we haven't previously had a theory of rational thought, right? We've had a theory of rational action, but when the objects that we're interested in studying are things like thoughts, having a theory that allows us to capture what rational thought looks like gives us a whole new set of tools for asking questions about, whether the things that we're doing inside our heads are the things that we should be doing inside our heads. And I think ultimately it gives us a path towards capturing some of these human capacities in AI systems too. So thinking about the way in which humans deal with our limited cognitive resources is something that opens the door to thinking about building AI systems that are going to have similar kinds of capacities. So thank you.
Great, Tom. Thank you so much. So I would encourage people to put, if you have questions, put them into the chat, or just say that you have a question, and we'll start a queue. I want to just briefly take the host prerogative to ask the first question while the queue is forming. I see in the chat. So I just want to, first of all, I just want to congratulate you on asking such a basic question. I mean, when I teach my introductory class to undergraduate cognition students, this is one of the points of greatest confusion in the whole course, between the sort of humans are not Bayesian, humans are irrational, Kahneman and Tversky position, which is so well ingrained into the field and which has been happening for 50 years. So it gets, I explain it as part of the course. But in the last 10, 15 years of my course, I've also included something about Bayesian cognitive science, and it leads to a fundamental confusion about whether modern cognitive science really thinks people are rational or not. And it's very hard to convey any kind of coherent answer to that, but I think you're on your way to that. But with that in mind, let me just ask you a couple of questions about it. So for one thing, it has become deeply ingrained in the culture that people are idiots. The way you said it at the beginning of the lecture, that people are subject to all kinds of cognitive illusions and fallacies, and it's become deeply ingrained into the whole field, behavioral economics, where it's taken for granted. I mean, not without evidence, but substantially accepted that people really are irrational. But you're arguing not only are they not really irrational, but in a sense, at this meta level that you're describing, they're more rational than they would be otherwise. I mean, so are you actually saying that it would be better, it would be a mistake, for example, for people to stop falling for the conjunction fallacy? That in some sense they're being meta level, even though they might make a mistake here or there in a psych experiment, they're at a meta level being more efficient by following the strategy that leads to fallacies like that. And so I guess my question is, what kind of reaction have you gotten from behavioral economists to this claim?
Yeah, so one thing that I want to be a little careful about is I think my primary claim here is sort of methodological rather than descriptive or even sort of strictly normative, in the sense that I think we can make a lot of progress in understanding aspects of human cognition by making these assumptions about rationality, rather than that being a claim that people are rational in some specific sense, right? And that's the same claim that's made in the context of things like rational analysis, where you don't need people to be 100% rational in order for that to be an effective tool to use. You just need that there be some correlation between the solution that they're using and the thing that ends up being the optimal solution to the problem. And I think the same thing applies. I kind of think about it as, okay, if you sort of give a rational analysis of a problem, that gives you, maybe like the first principle component. And then you can sort of, figure out something about, well, what are sort of constraints on architectures and computations and mechanisms? And maybe, this resource rationality maybe gives you like the second principle component, right? But then there's all of the other components here, which are a consequence of the specific mechanisms of, the neural systems and the other kinds of things that we're doing at the same time that are sort of constraining our utility functions and so on. And those things are not in here at all. So number one thing is, you should expect people to deviate from this kind of standard in the same way that you expect them to deviate from the sort of classical notions of rationality.
Right.
and then I think the other part is, if you can be classically rational, then you should, right? So no one's saying that when you go into a casino, you're better off being resource rational than you are than being, classically rational. It's just that it might not be realistic to be classically rational, and there are going to be circumstances where it's either not realistic in terms of the resources that you have, or it's not realistic in terms of the resources that you want to expend, right? So like maximizing your expected utility in your choice of toothbrush, that's probably a situation where some resource rationality would come in, and you can just choose a toothbrush, which is pretty good. But if you're, making decisions that involve millions of dollars and people's lives, then maybe we can aspire to, a better, exceeding the constraints that we operate under as individual humans. And
if you have access to more resources, you should use them.
Yep.
Right? If you have a bigger brain,
Right.
you should use it.
Yeah, and some of the work that we do is engaged with that kind of question. So Falk Leader, who is my student at Berkeley and is now running a group at Max Planck Institute, is like, he's a big advocate of improving people's lives through this kind of lens. And some of the work that we've done together has been focused on, okay, one thing that comes out of this is that if you think about the ways in which we're being irrational is partly a consequence of these cognitive constraints, that means that interventions that are like trying to make people think more Bayesian without making it sort of cognitively easier to do that, or sort of like just training people, is not going to be a particularly effective intervention. So we've focused more on interventions that modify the environment that you're in. And so we have various strategies for basically doing pre-computation and putting that pre-computation into the environment. And so what that does is it means that like the options that are presented to you or the rewards that are associated with them have computation that's gone into them, so that if you're then following a resource rational strategy, you'll nonetheless end up doing better than you would have. And we can do that as a consequence of having a framework that we can use for predicting people's choices.
Terrific. So I see in the chat, I guess Nir Ayal has a question.
Fascinating talk. Thank you. I have two questions, if I may. One is, I'm wondering about, you mentioned that some individuals divert from the model which is resource rational. Suppose somebody who's resource irrational in that sense is being told you're being irrational here. You're not using the rational strategy given your limited resources. And they answer the following. They say, well, for me, it would have been very costly to embark on what is usually a rational strategy. So I rationally am employing a second order strategy, which is rational, to limit how much I embark on the rational strategy. I'm wondering what you would say about this answer, whether that counts as rational, counts as irrational. If it counts as rational, doesn't that mean that in fact, what you're going for is not simply rational strategy, but rational highest relevant order strategy? Or I don't know what I'm interested in your account.
Yeah.
The second question. Okay, sorry.
Let me do that one maybe. So, I mean, I think this comes down to some of these same kind of normative issues, right? That sort of came up talking with Jacob, right? Where I think I think people can do something that makes sense subject to their own sort of utility and cost functions, right? I think that's the claim that you're making. And yeah, that can be something which is sort of, in this sense, rational for them to do. But it might be something which is different from either the sort of normative standard, what we think people should be doing in that problem, or the thing that other people might do, subject to different kinds of, constraints, right? I think you were also maybe hinting at this other question that comes up a lot, which is the sort of infinite regress problem, right? Where, what I've done here is basically take the rational decision-making and shift it up a level. So now the rational decision-making is happening at the level of cognitive actions rather than the level of actions in the world. One reason why I'm okay with that is that the time course of those things is quite different. So, the individual decision that you make is normally on a sort of time course that's sort of like a second's time course. Whereas these things that are operating at that higher level are things that you can imagine being sort of learned cognitive strategies that you've had many opportunities to learn over, many decisions that you might have made. And so, you can go another level above that. We've done a little bit of work looking at asking questions like, how should you build a cognitive architecture such that if you are then making this resource rational trade-off within that architecture, you end up making good decisions from which you can derive things like, well, maybe you want to have like a dual systems framework, right? Like a fast and a slow framework. That actually turns out to be a pretty good third order, or third order sort of, choice if you're trying to build a resource rational architecture. But that's a choice that happens not at the level of individual lifetimes, but at the level of, like sort of, more like, species level. And so I think one thing that makes me comfortable with that is that as you go up those levels of abstraction, the time units over which you're able to then learn those things become realistic, such that you could imagine that it's possible to converge to, more rational things at those levels.
Great. I think the next question is Barry Sofer.
Oh, is it okay if I?
Yes, thanks.
You
I'm
want to
Barry
ask a second?
Sofer. You're not Barry Sofer.
Well, Pierre said he had two questions, but yeah, Barry, why don't you go
okay.
ahead?
Do you want me to? Okay. This is an observation. Maybe I'm an experimental economist, not a behavioral economist, though. Roy Radner did some work back in the 90s on economic survival, and he just, I think this is related to what you're talking about. He kind of said, look, suppose we take the idea that people are just trying to maximize the probability that they survive and they don't go broke or they don't starve or whatever. And that's not expected utility, but it's kind of an efficient way to get there, is the way he posed it. So in some situations, you're going to be more cautious, look kind of risk averse. Like, if it's possible, you could lose a lot of money, but you've already got a lot. That would be the appropriate thing to do. In other cases where you're going to go broke and you're going to do something that makes you look risk seeking. And that's actually a good thing to do. So you maximize the chance of your survival. That strikes me as being something similar to what you're proposing here. There are no details, about like parameters and exactly what the cognitive process is, but it's kind of a fundamental biological urge, am I going to starve or am I going to go broke? And that's what's driving things. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I hadn't heard of that before, but it's certainly something I'll check out. I think one parallel there, right, is this kind of like recognition that variance is a thing that you should care about, right? So expected utility, by definition, is not about variance, but when you're thinking about things like survival, variance is a thing that you should care about. And so small samples and so on matter.
Yeah, like the Russian roulette.
Yeah. So the for navigational purposes, I think the closest thing to what I'm talking about in economics is rational inattention. So rational inattention has the same kind of idea that you have a trade-off where you have a cost for gathering information, and then are going to modulate that cost against the benefits that you get from it. The main difference is that it's a less cognitive theory, right? I kind of think about rational inattention as being more of a perceptual theory than a cognitive theory, and it actually has parallels with various sort of perceptual models too.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, Nir, do you want to ask your second question?
Thanks. Yes. So usually what I do is public health ethics, and in the area of food consumption, the thought is people not just once, but kind of very systematically make on certain issues very bad choices. So yes, we all do not, go for the, choose poison in the supermarket, literal poison that will kill us on the spot, but we systematically choose, the high carb, and that's where, people talk about some biases. And there are two kinds of those. One, which I think is very consistent with what you said, is that the supermarket, they know, say, we have an anchoring bias, which might, on the whole, be good for us, but they exploit that need. They place in front of us the high profit sodas instead of the things which are helpful. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about I think, again, that's totally consistent with our being rational to have that strategy, but still that strategy harms us in that, particular case that somebody uses it. But there is also just without any enemy exploiting our particular choice of strategy, just this fact about us that we, in certain areas, we systematically make bad choices. And I'm wondering, what is your account of that possibility? I mean, isn't that simple proof that we are embarrassing, or what would you make of that?
I mean, I think there's a distinction between, like, when you're saying you're making bad choices, you're defining an environment in which we're operating, right? And then looking at the choices that we make in that environment and showing that they're not good things to do. Whereas I think you could make an argument for that kind of case that, in fact, strategies that involve being attracted to high fats and sugars and so on are things that made sense in an environment where those kinds of resources were very constrained, in a way that parallels the kind of argument that I'm making about these other kinds of cognitive resources too. I think the point about supermarkets being able to exploit this, I mean, so I sort of mentioned this work that we've done on mitigating some of these factors by, putting computation in the environment. Some of that work we call optimal nudging, where it's basically like taking that nudging idea, and now once you have a theory of what strategy people will engage in as a consequence of the structure of the environment, you can then construct that environment in such a way that you support making better decisions. There's an adversarial version of that too, right? So we define our objective function when we're constructing that as one where we're trying to help people make better decisions with less thought. But if you're a supermarket, right, then your objective function is different. You want people to make decisions that result in you making the greatest profit. And I think effectively that's what they're doing, is that they're engineering things against the choice systems that we use that are subject to these resource constraints, so that whatever deviations we make from expected utility, those things are maximized, right? You can think about it the same in a casino. They have that same kind of objective function. And so, I wouldn't say that those things are things that we're, again, it's sort of like saying that you're doing the wrong thing and sort of, maximizing those deviations and so on. That's with respect to the objective function that the supermarket or their casino has, right? And that discrepancy in objective functions is the thing that then allows them to, lead people to make these decisions that may not be in people's best interest in the long term.
I have many follow-up questions about that, but I'm going to try to give other people the floor. So I think we have another question from Ron.
Hi. I wanted to ask you about, so you made this claim about expected utility theory being a kind of behaviorist theory. And there's this way in which, even when you move it up a level, you're really describing cognitive mechanisms that are computing costs of computations, but you're not really talking much about the mechanisms themselves. You're talking about sort of an equation that the mechanisms seem to follow. And I wondered if you had thought or explored this. So when I think about it, I think about like what exactly is assigning these costs, and how does this mechanism assign a cost to the amount to a particular computation at each level in extended process and things like this. And then I start thinking about what are the naturalistic constraints and what are the mechanisms that the mind is doing with this. And so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about, how the mind engages in this meta level process on your view.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just, the first part of what you said, I totally agree with. We're making very simplistic assumptions here. Part of the reason we're doing that is just to get this off the ground, right? But I think the idea is that putting these pieces in place, that then frees you up as a psychologist to go off and say, well, I actually want to understand exactly what the architecture is there, and I want to understand this. And the cool thing is, if you can specify those things, then we can derive the behavior that we predict would follow from that, right? Like that's the kind of cool thing about the framework. So I think there's a lot of room for doing that. I also think that there's a lot of ways in which that's more satisfying than the classical rational analysis, Bayesian modeling, right? Because it gives you lots more mechanisms that can vary. So if you're a developmental psychologist, now you can think about, changes in beliefs of children happening as a consequence of maturational processes, as well as the data that children are getting. If you're interested in individual differences, now you can measure various aspects of deviation in the architecture across people, and then you can make predictions about how that should affect the strategies that people will use. And you can get sort of weird, interesting nonlinearities that come out of that. In terms of the second part of like, how I imagine those metacognitive processes working, I don't think there's one answer to that question. I think there's at least three, right? So those three answers are, one of them is stuff that actually looks like meta reasoning, right? Sort of like on the fly coming up with a strategy you're going to use to solve a problem. One of them is something that looks, this is an interesting, so this connection to Markov decision processes and to the reinforcement learning literature, I think actually sets this up very nicely, where in the reinforcement learning literature, you have this idea of like model-based versus model-free, right? So model-based is that first thing, right? You've got sort of a model of your internal environment, and then you're sort of figuring out, well, how should I use my resources best? The model-free version is what we call metacognitive reinforcement learning. We've done some studies where we've looked at this. I can show you some results if you want. But the idea there is that essentially what you can do is your goal in solving this meta-level Markov decision process is you have to estimate this thing that's called the value of computation that's associated with every computation. And that's equivalent to like a Q value in a standard reinforcement learning problem. And so you can use the same kind of Q learning or sort of other sorts of reinforcement learning algorithms to learn how good is it to engage in this kind of computation in this particular situation. And so from that, you can then sort of learn the pieces that you need in order to then have a relatively instinctive sort of cognitive strategy that you derive. And then the third is, some of this stuff might just be stuff that we're sort of built in, right, in terms of the, default cognitive processes that we engage in when we're presented with a stimulus, right? And so, it's going to be those things because those are the things that we know are characteristic of how people solve these sorts of reinforcement learning problems in the external world. And it's exactly this sort of same mapping of those things onto the control of our internal cognitive processes.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so Veronica, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, so I was interested in something that came up when you were talking about importance sampling. So there's this issue with some kind of circularity because you want to be more likely to sample possibilities that would have very high or very low utility given some action. But that's like what you're trying to calculate. So yeah, I was just curious if you have some idea of how that can be tackled like algorithmically, and especially in some cases with like sharks, maybe like shark situations are always have a red flag on them. But in some cases, it's just some kind of ordinary situation that in my decision context would have a really, really low utility or really, really high. So yeah, if you have any ideas about how to deal with that or know of any work on that, I'm very interested.
Yeah, so in this paper, let's put it up here. So with Falco, we actually have a more recent paper. There's like a 2018 paper with the same authors. We have some speculation about mechanisms there. One of the things that I'd say about it is that I think it's a kind of solution that maps pretty naturally onto sort of psychological mechanisms here, where if you think about what that solution looks like, it has these two parts, the probability that you encounter something, and then this sort of like this utility associated with it. And you could roughly think about this as, an experiential and emotional term here or something like that, right? So any kind of mechanism that means that you are more likely to store in memory things that are extremal, right? Or more likely to like retrieve those things from memory. So basically the way in which you're getting these samples is you're probing your memories, and the stuff that's in memory is the product of like, when you've encountered that thing and, like how well it is stored or how salient it is in memory. Any of those kinds of mechanisms will produce this sort of effect.
Cool, thanks.
So Tom, I wanted to drill in a little bit on the kind of comparison between the two levels of rationality. So I mean, the way I was describing before, and a little bit the way you motivated at the beginning of the talk, is there's sort of traditionally a sort of Bayesian position that people are output rational, and a heuristics and biases tradition where people are not. But there is this third position in the field that's pretty salient, the so-called adaptive rationality view. Gigerenzer and Hertwig and Todd, et cetera, that where they basically have claimed in many papers and books that that following simple heuristics, and I think they're really talking about just the output rationality, level can actually be superior to supposedly normative or Bayesian procedures. And they give lots of examples like this example that they use over and over again of a heuristic that you use about the angle between your line of sight and a ball that you're following in order to catch the ball, which they claim is superior to the supposedly optimal Bayesian procedure. And so, I mean, so in a sense, they're making a similar argument to you that there's a better way of a better motivation for why heuristics are rational. But it is contrary to your point, because they are actually, you're not actually claiming that that optimality is not I don't know how to characterize it, but optimality is not optimal. You're just articulating another meta level at which certain decision procedures are optimal. So I guess my question is, what do you think about their position, and how do you resolve this?
So the part of that argument which says that this thing is better than the optimal thing, that can't be true, right? Like by
that's why I had
definition,
trouble
right?
saying it. But
So the way that they typically make that argument is a consequence of model misspecification. So it's sort of showing a circumstance where the true model of the environment does not align with the the Bayesian model that's being used, and as a consequence, the optimal solution is something that deviates from that Bayesian model, right? So, like the cases where I think about it like this are things like in their feature weighting examples, they sort of contrast it with like a generic linear regression model, and there's no sort of appropriate regularization of that model. And so a linear regression model that's not appropriately regularized is going to do worse than a simple heuristic in an environment where you have relatively few features and relatively little information about them, or a relatively large number of features and relatively little information about them. And so I think that's a move that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? One thing that's nice about what I'm doing here is that it actually sort of formalizes exactly what this relationship is, in the sense that you can look at this and you can see that this is like that, but with an extra conditioning and with a cost function, right? So if you remove this conditioning and you assume that you have veridical beliefs and that you don't care about computational cost, then you recover the original sort of expected utility. So it shows that if this is the thing that you care about, you're going to recover a solution that's strictly worse by optimizing this, right? And that should be true, right? That having these kinds of computational constraints means that you're doing worse than this characterization of what the optimal behavior actually is. Other than that, I mean, I would say, I think there are there's a number of the cases that they identify, the heuristics that you get are things that make sense from a Bayesian perspective, right? From this kind of regularization perspective. And that's made explicit. Some of Gigerenz's most recent work kind of focuses on characterizing this in terms of a bias variance trade-off, right? So this sort of idea from statistics that there's two ways to go wrong when it's what came up in my importance sampling example, two ways to go wrong when you're trying to generalize. You can have a model that's too simple, in which case you have bias, or a model that's too complex, in which case you have variance. And so from that bias variance argument, you would expect that simpler strategies in some circumstances will work better, and that's the thing that they're focused on. So I feel like there's no inconsistency there, but that's still not a that theory is still not a resource rational theory, in the sense that it doesn't care about computational cost, right? So their argument is entirely an argument which is based on the bias variance trade-off. And so one thing that I think, one reason why that argument doesn't work very well is that the bias variance trade-off depends on how much data you have. So as you get more data, you should begin to favor more complex models. And so if that's really what's driving these kind of simple heuristics, you would make a prediction that, whether or not you engage in a simple heuristic is going to be a function of the amount of data that you have for making a decision, or, we should be able to find circumstances that push away from that. So I think in order to get to the really simple heuristics that they favor, you do need to have a kind of computational cost being factored into the decision in a way that's not in their theory. And I've talked about that with Gigerenzer, and he says, yeah, that's probably right. But when he was originally advocating this, he wanted to make this contrast between what he was proposing and what Kalman and Tversky were proposing, where his characterization of Kalman and Tversky is that they say people are lazy, and so they make these mistakes, right? And so he wanted to say, it's not that people are lazy, it's that these are good strategies. And so as a consequence of that, it's anathema in his world to talk about computational cognitive cost, because that's weighing into this, like, people are lazy
Right.
sort of side of the argument. But I think it's necessary in order to actually justify the heuristics that they end up with,
That's
as
very
opposed to some slightly more complex thing that, you know, is modulated by the amount of data that you get.
Yeah, I mean, it is a little hard to evaluate their proposals along those lines because, as you say, they don't formalize them, so it's hard to see exactly what sense of optimality they're alluding to. Except
Yeah, although I recommend these papers with Henry Brighton and Gigerenzer that are on this sort of bias variance trade-off perspective, because it's at least a more explicit formal characterization.
But so if I can, I mean, again, I'm only hogging the floor because no one else is asking a question at this exact second. But please, others, if you have a question, chime in the chat. But let me just follow up on something else you said before. You alluded to this idea that some strategies that people follow in everyday life might have been adaptive in our evolutionary environment. We look for high-fat foods in our prehistoric environment, and we're still doing it today, even though it's no longer adaptive. That's a very common point. I think that people make some version of that as a kind of. I mean, I don't mean this negatively because I kind of agree with it, but as sort of hand-wavy justification for some apparently irrational actions. But it's something that I wonder if why it hasn't been formalized more. So, I mean, one question that you could ask to challenge the rational side is sort of, why are people so insensitive to changes in their environment? Like, it's not impossible to learn that we are no longer in the ancient savannah, and we should probably stop eating high-fat food. But people are very resistant to updating their priors, or some argument like that. And conversely, to against the heuristics and biases side. In all the experiments that led to that framework, they usually assume that people have to take as given the assumptions that are given to them by the experimenter. You have a 10% chance of winning $50, and they made no allowances for the fact that people don't always quite have the same priors or beliefs in their heads that they were given by the experimenter. So all of that is just a way of saying, is there some way to quantify the assumptions that people have and how they might deviate from what might be treated in a rational model as the normative assumptions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, and I think it gets at this kind of like, what's the next principal component here, right? Like, because it's entirely about mechanisms and their plasticity, right? Like, here when we talk about resource rationality, we're making an assumption that you have the ability to make certain choices, right? And to control, you basically have to make some decisions about the variables that you have control over. In some of our other work, we have tried to engage with this. There's a fun paper that Paul Kruger and I wrote, which is basically, imagine that you are a model-based decision maker trapped in a model-free body. So, which I think is actually a reasonable description of things like dieting, right? Where, trying to regulate your diet, where you have some instinctive reward response to certain kinds of foods, right? And then it's the model-based system inside your head that's saying, in the long term, this is going to be a bad decision. And so the way that we formulated that problem was to say, so if you know that your decisions are going to be being made by a model-free agent, and the only thing that you have control over as the model-based agent is the rewards that model-free agent receives, then how should you as the model-based agent influence the rewards that are experienced by the model-free agent? And so what we show is that there's actually a result that comes from the literature. It's actually called shaping in AI, in reinforcement learning. There's an optimal form for the way that you should modify the reward signal in order to get an agent to learn a policy more effectively. And so what you do is basically you take the reward that is associated with a state, and then you define this additional potential function on top of it that reflects the long-term value function. And so the model-based learner sort of says, okay, what I'm going to do is compute the value of every state, and then I'm going to sort of modulate the reward that the model-free learner receives by that long-term value. So you're getting sort of the immediate value, but you're also getting this term which reflects the long-term. And then if you actually sit down and think about this psychologically, well, what does this correspond to? What it corresponds to is kind of these, like moral emotions, where, like if you think about it objectively, it's kind of hard to justify when after doing something bad, we then feel bad about it, right? Because that's only decreasing our utility, right? So doing something and then feeling bad about it is only a net decrease in our sort of integrated over time, how good we feel about things. But if you think about it from this perspective, if your model-based system is able to make your model-free system experience a negative reward by feeling bad about, after doing something that provided an objective experience that was a positive one from the world, that's exactly the way that you want to modulate that kind of system. And so I think that's in some ways, engaging with this bigger problem that we have, which is that, yeah, a lot of our decisions are being made by, outdated technology, and we're in the position of trying to steer that system towards better choices.
Yeah, I wonder if this could be applied to political theory a little bit to make collective choices at the national level that were somewhat more rational or meta-rational. That might be something we could aspire to as a nation.
Yeah, so we've used the same idea in the context of just helping to improve individual decisions, where it turns into what we call optimal gamification. So you basically modulate the rewards that are associated with actions in a way that reflects the long-term value. And so by doing that, we've actually, this is a paper with Falk, which is on what we call cognitive prostheses. We were able to do things like reduce the amount that people procrastinate. So procrastination is a kind of reward function problem, where if you think about what it is, it's something where there's a big payoff that you get, but there's lots of small negative costs in order to get to that point. And so if you do this kind of gamification according to this sort of formula, what it does is it takes that big reward and it splits it up into smaller pieces. And so you sort of have this breadcrumb trail of like, you get a little reward for the first one, and then the next reward is a little bigger, and the next reward is a little bigger, in exactly the way that if you're playing a video game, right, you sort of experience. And so by doing that and taking tasks that people have and then figuring out how to gamify them appropriately, we can actually get them to do a better job of achieving their goals.
That's terrific. So thank you so much, Tom. I think we're essentially out of time because we have a schedule to follow for the poster session. So first of all, I want to thank Tom again. Everybody, applause again for the terrific talks, interesting from so many different directions, not only the psychology and the computer science, but also the economics and the public policy that you touched on. So I want to invite everybody to join us for the poster sessions, which basically they're the next 2 hours from 12:30 to 1:30, and then again, different phase from 1:30 to 2:30. We're going to have phases of posters, which are just Zoom links with breakout rooms where you can just get a little bit of taste of the variety of work that's gone on in the Center for Cognitive Science in the last year. So I don't know, Jason, if you're still on the call, if you could clarify where to get the Zoom link. I'm actually not clear myself.
Yeah, so these are just breakout rooms. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms
from this link.
Yeah, from this
Right.
room. Yeah, so you're staying in this room and you're just going to click on the breakout rooms button at the bottom. So if you have the latest version of Zoom, you should be able to go from breakout room to breakout room. And if you have any issues, try emailing me or try emailing Sarah, and we'll try to help.
Okay, thanks. And for everybody, there's a schedule available on the Center for Cognitive